Hi everybody and welcome. We're ready to make a start. Apologies for a slightly late start, but I just want to make sure we give everyone the opportunity to get through on time. We've got over 404 people registered today. It's a bit worrying, and that's a 404 error, so hopefully we won't have too many technical problems as we're going through today's session. So yeah, over 400 people registered. We've got just shy of that coming through in terms of the participants coming through. So thank you very much for your time today to spend some of your hours or so together. And this is a webinar series. Now, first thing to mention, this is webinar number 3 of 3. But do not fear, if you haven't been able to make some or all the other sessions, don't worry, it's not dependent on the previous sessions. And also the good news is those sessions number 1 and number 2 are actually available on the CIPD website as well, as this webinar will be in time once we've recorded it and put it onto the website. So don't worry if you are dipping in just for number 3, that's absolutely fine. But if you want number 1 and 2, you can go and grab them as well. That will work quite nicely for you. So today's session is around action to help prevent unethical behaviour. And then I'll get into kind of the objectives introduction shortly, but just to make sure you set up on the webinar environment as best as you possibly can. Ideally, you're hearing me right now, so hopefully that's okay in terms of what you're hearing across the superhighways. In terms of actually seeing the deck itself, I've just clicked through a couple of slides now. I'm back onto the slide we were at the holding slide at the very start. The main thing here you need to do, if you can, don't worry if you can't, it's not going to be a big problem if you can't, is activate your chat function. And to do that, you just need to click on the icon here you can see on your toolbar. You hover over and use your mouse. You should be able to see that circular blue button with a kind of chat bubble. You click on that, that should give you access to the chat window on the right-hand side. And that means if anybody asks any questions or you want to ask a question yourself, you can pop it into the chat and keep an eye on that stream as it goes down the right-hand side. So it's a great way to interact with us. In terms of questions, we'll hopefully have time at the end for a Q&A. Now, what you can do is pop your Q&A, your question in, and I can either ask it at the right time, if appropriate, so I might have to interrupt the presenter if it's a clarity question or add to the actual presentation at that point in time, or I'll hold that question till a bit later on. So please feel free to pop your questions in the chat bar, and we'll deal with them either ongoing or towards the end. So that's our plan in terms of taking it forward. That's who we've got with us today. We've got myself on the left-hand side. I'm the radio DJ. I'm the host. I get the easy job on the left-hand side. So my name's Stuart Hayden. I'm the commercial learning consultant at the CIPD. So I'll hold together the polls, the chat functions, and the closed session towards the end. So you won't hear too much of me once I finish speaking at the very start here. And then in the order of presentations, because it's always nice to get a sense of whose voice is whose, we're going to hear from Gwen, first of all, who's Head of Research at IBE. I'm going to give you a quick bio of our presenters in that order. So Gwen will be up first. And she's Head of Research at the IBE. She provides advice and support to organisations how to improve the effectiveness of different aspects of their ethics programs, including their code of ethics. She writes and researches on a wide range of business ethics topics at the IBE, and her most recent publication is Embedding Business Ethics 2020 Report on Corporate Ethics Policies and Programs, which you're going to hear a lot more about in Gwen's presentation first up. Then our second presenter is me, Mel Green, Research Advisor at the CIPD. She joined the team in 2017 and conducts research in a number of different areas, including diversity, organisation development, and of course, ethics at work. And her recent work includes assessing the evidence on inclusion, assessing the risk factors for unethical behaviour, and exploring the future of OD practice. And prior to the CIPD, Mel was a HR practitioner in a technology organisation, working on a variety of different HR initiatives, and has previously worked as a researcher in employee engagement as well as well-being. And Johnny will be our third presenter. Johnny is the Senior Advisor for Organisational Behaviour at CIPD. He's a long-standing career in applied research in employment and people management. His current interests include job quality and good work, and he leads the CIPD's UK Working Live survey and behavioural science insights into aspects of HR, such as performance management. And Johnny directs the CIPD Applied Research Conference and actively promotes evidence-based practice, including systematic reviewing of running randomized trials. He's an academic member of the CIPD and a fellow of the Centre for Evidence-Based Management. So those are our 3 wonderful presenters as we're going through today's session. Let me give you a quick insight of the objectives, and I'll pass over to Gwen, then it'll be Mel, and then Johnny. And actually, these objectives broadly align to each of the 3 presenters and the 3 presentations as we're going through. So the first session objective for today is define recent research into ethics and codes. And I'm sure you can see from the facilitator backgrounds, you're going to get a great deal of overview in terms of research and ethics and codes. Number two, broadly, in terms of our middle section today out of the three, is about identifying key areas and exploring the sticky situations that are linked to unethical behaviour. And then finally, we'll look at describing the extent to which unethical behaviour is due to rotten apples. And actually, you put 2 and 3 together, you'll hear more about our CIPD report there. And the rotten apples might include individual factors such as mood and personality. So without further ado, I'll hand over the presenter rights to Gwen, and she'll do the lion's share of the presenting on our first section. Okay, Gwen, just passing the rights over to you. You should be good to move through the slides.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stuart. Thanks for having me today on this webinar, and I'm really pleased to be talking about codes of ethics, because this is something that is really core to what we do at the Institute of Business Ethics. And here on this slide, I just put a couple of information about some information about who we are and what we do, for those of you who might not be familiar with the IBE. So it was the Institute was established in 1986 with the aim of promoting high standards of business behavior based on ethical values, and this is something that we very much holds true today as well. And to achieve this purpose, there's a variety of activities that we do, as you can see here on the slide. In particular, I'm head of research, so I look after the publications and the surveys that we run at the Institute. Some of them, including the one that Stuart just mentioned now, the Embedding Business Ethics, is quite a long-standing one. The first time that was run was 1995. So it's really interesting to see how the role of codes and ethics program has evolved since then. But really, I'd like to encourage you to go on our website to have a look, because all our surveys are available for free download. So if you want to have a bit more of a insight into the results, please do feel free to have a look on the website. But before we get into the actual results, and I share about some data about codes of ethics with you today, I'd like to run a quick poll, a quick question to see how widespread codes of ethics are amongst our audience today.
Perfect. So I've just opened the poll, so you should be able to hit the polling function. If for any reason you can't, don't worry at all. We're still going to get a good number of people through the poll to give us a sense check of what the results are looking like. Just to let you know, we've got about 112 people online, 113. It's just going up. In fact, it'll probably go up as I keep speaking. And if you want to put it in the chat, for any reason you can't poll, you could do that, put your response in there as well, but you don't need to, because obviously that's fine. I'll just read out the questions again, just in case anybody's got problems getting the visual on this one. Does your organization have a code of ethics or similar document that is publicly available on the website? 3 choices, nice and easy, yes, no, or you don't know, not sure. So Gwen, we've got over 75 people through the polling booth. Apologies for just finding the right button or contemplating your answer. There will be another one later. Sometimes people are a bit quicker second time around, so I'll close it down and then we should be able to see the results pretty shortly. Takes a few minutes for the poll to collate all our scores. And then once we've done that, we should be able to get a sense check of what we've got across the 3 scores or the 3 answers amongst our group today. When it's 3, 2, 1 seconds pretty much coming through, should be able to see it. I'm going to share those now.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I can see that 38% of you have that said yes, that their organization has a code of ethics that is publicly available on the website, which is slightly lower than the results from our depth of research, which I can show you now here. So this is a map of Europe based on research that we did on the website of the largest listed companies, which is probably why the results differ a little bit compared to the poll. And as you can see, codes of ethics have become a really common element of a company's approaches to ethics. And also one thing I'd like to point out is that the UK apparently is the country with the lowest percentage of companies that have a code of ethics, which is probably a bit surprising for some. So if you have any comments about that, please let me know. It'd be really interesting to hear your views on that as well. Another element that I wanted to point out on this map that we put there together with the presence of a code is the presence of core values. The reason for this is that we have seen an evolution not just in the presence of a code. For example, when we did our research in 1995, I remember that reading it, there was a section that explained in the views of, so basically it was an interview with the CEO, and they explained why codes of ethics were not useful at all for a company. So probably today we wouldn't see something like that in a publication nowadays. But basically, we've also seen an evolution in the nature of the code. So it used to be in 1995 when we started, it used to be basically codes based on rules. So codes of conduct with a list of rules for people to follow. Whereas with the time going by, we've seen an evolution in this types of document that have become much more based on values rather than rules. And this is something that is reflected also in our survey, in our research that we did in the follow-up interviews that we did for this report, because for the first time since 1995, a code is not seen anymore as just a document to provide guidance to staff, but as a way of creating a shared and consistent corporate culture. And actually, a code is also really, really key for a company's ethics program in general. So at the IB, we have designed this framework that you can see on the slide now. And this is basically the product of the work that we've done with different organizations of all sizes. And we have identified these different elements of a company's ethics program. As you can see, as I mentioned, everything starts with the ethical values, which are then translated into a code of ethics that explain how these values apply in practice to the specific organization. But the code of ethics is necessary but not sufficient. So a code on its own, we have seen that is not enough to ensure that ethical standards are embedded at all levels in a business. So there are other points and other elements that are important to keep in mind when we think about a code of ethics. So we don't have just a PDF on our website, but we have something that is supported by a communication campaign, by a speak up line, by strong leadership, by training, and also by a regular review process. On the one hand, we had this research that we did amongst large organizations, but then we wanted to understand a bit more what employees think and their awareness of these instruments and tools that companies have, for example, a code of ethics. So in a different survey that we conducted, we asked employees and we asked them whether they were aware that their company provides the different elements of an ethics program, as I illustrated just a moment ago in the IBE framework. So this chart that you can see on the slide now is taken from a different survey that we ran. Last time it was run in 2018, but again, this one is done every 3 years as well, and it's called Ethics at Work, funnily enough. But so we can see that there's a big discrepancy between the percentage of companies that have a code of ethics and the percentages of employees that say that actually they are aware of this code of ethics offered by their organization. So again, the sample here is slightly different, so there might be an explanation there in terms of a size of companies, for example. But this goes to show also how important it is that employees are also communicated and engaged with the ethics program of the organization. So in the evolution of the codes of ethics that we have seen since 1995, there's also an evolution of the ethics program and the other supporting tools. And as you can see from this slide, there's still a bit of room for improvement because 59% of employees are aware that the company offers a code of ethics. But when you look at the other indicators of the other tools or building blocks of an ethics program, they're not as widely known and recognized by employees as the code of ethics. So if we don't really pay attention to this aspect, if we don't make sure that the code is actually supported in that sense, we run the risk a little bit that is just another document on the website that is not really used or made useful to employees. Does it work? So we decided not to look at the code of ethics in isolation for the reasons that I just explained, but we tried to look at the impact that an ethics program, so a code of ethics with all the surrounding elements, can have on the culture of an organization. So we decided to look at the companies where, in the survey that I just mentioned, Ethics at Work, we decided to look at employees that said that they were aware of all the 4 building blocks of an ethics program, and we compared their responses to employees that were not aware of any of the 4 elements of an ethics program. So we see when a code of ethics, speak-up line, training are provided, the perception of culture improves significantly. So for example, employees say that honesty is practiced more often, or the organization is seen as more responsible in their business dealing. And this one, I think, is quite important because it's basically employees are more willing to talk about misconduct, to report misconduct that they are witnessing, that they see. And in particular, they're also more likely to be happy and satisfied with the company's response. So it's definitely a step in the right direction in terms of creating a shared and consistent corporate culture that we mentioned earlier at the beginning, and the companies seem to be willing to create, and the companies seem to be, they say that they want to use a code of ethics to achieve the idea of an ethical culture based on values for all their employees. What should the code of ethics look like? So this is something that we work quite a lot on as the IBE. We work with organizations of all sizes, all sectors and types to help them improve the effectiveness of the code of ethics. So obviously, there is not a template that can be downloaded and used by all organizations, because the code is something that is very much the product of the culture of the specific organization. However, we have identified a few elements that I think are quite interesting and we think should be always included in a code. And maybe we can go back to some of these a bit more in detail in the Q&A part. But now I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of some of these elements. So for example, an endorsement from the senior leadership, because the code needs to be seen as coming from or with endorsement from the top of the organization. The CEO and the board need to show that it is important for them. An explanation as to why the code is necessary. So it's not just a list of rules that we have decided that you have to follow, but it's useful for the organization. It contributes to the success of the organization. An explanation of what the company's values are, which is useful because it helps going a little bit beyond just the rules and support decision-making in those situations that might not be covered in the code itself, because it's really hard to put into the code every possible situation that might arise, but can actually work as a decision-making guidance for employees in those situations. And then again, this can be supported by a framework for ethical decision-making. Sometimes this just takes the form of a series of questions to ask yourself when you face a difficult situation, but it's just a way of stop and reflect on the situation that you're facing, the dilemma that you're facing as an employee. And then finally, some information about how to raise concerns and speak up about wrongdoing, because this is really, really important to make sure that employees are engaged and they feel part of an organization that wants to listen to them, is interested in their issues and their problems, and also acts to address those issues that employees raise. So this is a bit of an overview of what a code of ethics are, why it is important and why it is useful. And I look forward to more discussion later in the Q&A session. And I can pass on to Mel for the next presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mel Green here from the CIPD. Stuart's already introduced me, so I won't say too much more about myself. Thanks very much for joining us today, and thanks to Gwen for that really interesting exploration of your recent research into code of ethics. So in my slot today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the situational factors that influence ethical behaviour, which we've affectionately called sticky situations. So I'm going to delve into some of our recent research into the topic and talk a little bit more about how those situations and difficult aspects of our work can make it difficult for us to behave. So as Stuart mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this is actually a series of webinars. So if you've already attended the first two in this series, you're probably familiar with this already, but I'll just talk a little bit about it for those of you who are joining us new today. So we've recently at the CIPD conducted an evidence review of unethical behaviour at work, which is called Rotten Apples, Bad Barrels and Sticky Situations, a review of unethical workplace behaviour. And what we've also done alongside that, my wonderful colleagues Tina Russell and Ali Weeks of the CIPD have also created a guide based on that evidence review. So what this evidence review was really all about was understanding some of the factors that influence unethical behaviour at work. So we often hear, especially when corporate scandals make the news, that things like a few rotten apples are to blame for unethical behaviour, or perhaps a poor company culture. And of course there's some truth in that, those things are important, but it's also really important that we understand on a more granular day-to-day level what some of the risk factors that we face in our day-to-day work. Because of course there are things like practices and policies, individual differences that also make an impact on how we act in our workplace. So this research was all about uncovering that, doing an evidence review for the best available evidence on those factors. And what we did in this research is identify 9 areas, and that's what makes up the report and the guidance as well. So if you're interested in looking in more detail at the research and the guidance, definitely go and have a look on our website. I think we've just placed those links within the chat for this as well. So as the name of the report suggests, we highlight 3 broad areas that influence unethical behaviour. And those are the rotten apples, so the individual choices that we make at work, the bad barrels, or hopefully good barrels too, the environment, culture, or climate that's in our organisation, and also the difficult decisions and situations, or the sticky situations at work that make our lives a little bit difficult. And today, Johnny and I will talk about those difficult decisions and situations, and also the individual choices or rotten apples part of this research. So, thinking about those sticky situations, what are some of the key things that might influence our behaviour at work? And I think it's really important before I talk about these is they're very much influences or risk factors. So one of these things alone might not guarantee that unethical behaviour is going to happen in our workplaces. However, it might make it more likely, or in conjunction with another risk factor, make it more likely to happen. So we found a number of situational factors that influence unethical behaviour, or in fact reduce the likelihood of unethical behaviour as well. So on the positive side of things, we found that when people had varied roles and accountability designed into their jobs, as well as things like checks, balances and reminders to behave ethically, that reduced the likelihood of unethical behaviour. On the other hand, there are a couple of negative factors to think about that might increase the likelihood of unethical behaviour. And those are things like highly competitive roles or marketplaces, as well as unrealistic goals that are tied to monetary reward. There's also aspects like time pressure and monotony in jobs, which is an interesting one. So if someone has a monotonous role, they might actually be more likely to behave unnecessarily. And lastly, being removed from the outcomes of your decisions. So for example, if you are a decision maker and you don't see the end result of your decisions, it might be more likely that you'll make a decision that has an ethical impact in the end. And what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about some of those in more detail, specifically the goals, rewards, and the competitive aspects of job design that might influence unethical behaviour. Before I jump into that though, I'd really like to hear from you all and wonder if any of those factors resonate with you. So have you seen any examples perhaps in your own workplaces, naming no names, or in high profile cases of unethical behaviour, where things like pressurised roles, targets, or anything else have made a difference and been linked to unethical behaviour in your workplace?
Thanks, Mel. Just whilst people are typing in their quick responses in the chat, and don't worry about spelling and grammar, by the way, everyone. We've got a quick question. Maybe we could just give it a quick cover before we get the responses in the chat. The question is, have we undertaken any research into groupthink at senior leadership level and unethical behaviour in large organisations? So kind of like the groupthink large organisation context.
So within this research, we didn't specifically look at groupthink per se, but I think that's there's a really interesting point there linked to that, which is about accountability. So of course, when decisions are made in a group, there's a lack of sort of thought and engagement with sort of ethical outcomes of decisions that are linked to groupthink, then that's something that we've definitely highlighted as a potential risk factor. So if there's not checks and balances in place, for example, or perhaps there's a lack of accountability, then that can make a difference, yeah.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that's a great question, isn't it? So thanks for the question as well. So there's a couple of responses meanwhile coming through on the chat further to this exercise here.
Yeah, there's some interesting responses here. So things like time pressure caused by unrealistic deadlines, time pressure in general does seem to be a factor in a lot of jobs, which definitely rings true in some of our research, and pressure on managers to deliver, to influence them, to pressurise staff. There's another interesting point about here of business owner being profit driven, and so profit was the main driver, and reinforced the idea that you need to do what's necessary to preserve profit. And that's a really interesting example because it highlights some of the different outcomes of our decisions. So perhaps the business outcome of profit is more important than any potential ethical outcomes, whether that's employee well-being or something else that impacts your customers or the end user. So lots of really interesting examples there. So thanks for all your responses. I'm going to pick up on a couple of those actually when I talk a little bit about the research now. So I'm going to move on and give a couple of examples of what our research tells us, which very much echoes some of the things that I'm seeing in the chat there. So the first risk factor is all about competitive environments, which is linked to organisational goals. So I think it's also worth noting that when we talk about unethical behaviour, we often think of things like fraud, sabotage, theft, things that negatively impact end users or even employees. But people also do make decisions and act in a certain way that might be unethical, but actually in the short term could benefit the organisation. So very much linked to that profit outcome, for example. And there's some really interesting research in this area that suggests that if organisations are in a competitive market, unethical behaviour that's pro the organisation, so for example, might help them get ahead in sales, but maybe not in the most ethical way, it's actually more likely that that's going to happen. And not only that, there's other research that suggests that in that sort of situation, managers might be hesitant to reprimand people for that behaviour, especially if it results in short-term benefit for that company. And that's also the case if that person might be a top performer. So the research also suggests that if someone's really good at their job, let's say they're hitting all their targets, if they do something that's potentially unethical, they might be less likely to be reprimanded for that as well. So a bit of a tension there between outcomes such as profits and ethics. And it's not just external either. There's also a note about competitive environments internally. So there's research that suggests that there's competition to be the best. So let's say an employee knew where they were on a performance curve and they were going to be evaluating their performance at the end. There's some research to suggest that if that's coupled with monetary rewards, so for example, getting a bonus, that can encourage sabotaging others' work or misrepresenting their own work. And just to reiterate as well that these are all experimental studies that give us a really interesting insight, but it's also worth noting that, of course, a target alone or competition alone isn't going to cause unethical behaviour, but there's certain situations that make it more likely. And the same with reward as well. So we've done research into the impact of reward previously, which is called Show Me the Money, which is a really interesting read, which is all about the impact of reward and targets on people's behaviour at work. And there's some evidence to suggest that strongly used performance-related pay and really high and difficult to reach targets can have an impact on unethical behaviour. So, for example, there's examples, ambulance drivers within this research that suggest that when there's a target of getting patients in quickly, ambulance drivers would prioritise patients nearer to them rather than by their need. Obviously, this is a really extreme example, but it really shows that what you reward and how you reward that can influence people's behaviour. And of course, that's why we do it in the first place, but it also means that if we're not making our rewards clear and not aligning them with multiple outcomes, that can be an issue. There's also experimental research that suggests that difficult goals can lead to things like misreporting. So employees want to make sure they hit their goals, so they might misreport what they do. However, when an opportunity for a promotion was at stake, this wasn't the case. So in other words, if there's more than one outcome that's important to employees that isn't just linked to reward, for example, or monetary reward, then that can offset some of that. So really it's all about whether our reward strategies and targets might mean that people try and hit the target but miss the point. So think about the ethics and the long-term outcomes of their behaviour. So great if you hit your sales target, but if it's done in an unethical way or not in a long-term sustainable way, then it's not going to have good long-term outcomes. And there's some really clear real-life examples here, some of which we've talked about in the chat as well. So things like the Wells Fargo cross-selling scandals. This is a quote from one of their senior staff members that says, "Our team members do have goals, and sometimes they can be blinded by a goal." So within this, there was lots of issues with mis-selling and fraudulent products, so employees can meet their targets. And again, targets alone don't cause this. However, there was also a couple of whistles blown about their culture and their wider organisational values. So in combination, this seems to have an issue. And we can see similar outcomes with things like the PPI scandal, which is linked to highly commission-based selling, and also in some NHS trust scandals where targets of cost-cutting were at odds with patient care. So importantly, what does this mean for practice? So within our research and our guidance, we also provide some kind of lessons and top tips for practitioners. And the main takeaway really is when it comes to the situations and job design, it's be aware of these risk factors and manage them. So these are some of the risk factors I've just spoken about, like goals and targets are tied to purely financial outcomes, or when things like performance-related pay are at stake, where you're operating in a competitive market or workplace, or people are under pressure, or some of those other things that I talked about at the beginning, which didn't have time to delve into today, things like having monotonous roles or having a lack of understanding of what the impact of your decisions will be. And practically, what might that look like? So that might be things like considering what behaviour is incentivised or rewarded and what your reward strategy is, and thinking about how goals and targets can be related to multiple outcomes or organisational values as well as profit. There might be other metrics that employees should be measured on as well, such as long-term outcomes that can help. And also to put support in place in decision-making, especially when being made in a pressurised environment. They kind of mentioned this a little bit as well, so using things like checks and balances, frameworks to help guide decision-making, or perhaps even using moral reminders to regularly communicate with employees about the role of they have in being ethical. That can also really help. So that's it from me on the sticky situation side of the research. There's more in our report which talks a little bit about some of those other risk factors. I'll hand over to Johnny now, who's going to talk about the rotten apples that can influence unethical behaviour.
Just past the presenter rights to you, Johnny, so you should be good to take yourself off mute and take us on to the next set of slides. You're still on mute, Johnny, if you're okay and still with us, all right? So we can't hear you currently. Sorry about this, everyone. I'm not sure where Johnny is, so I'll just give him a minute or two. Maybe he's having some tech problems.
Hi, I hope you can hear me now. I was having tech problems indeed. Thanks very much, Stuart, and thanks, Mel and Gwen. So my name's Johnny Gifford. I work in the research team at the CIPD along with Mel. And I'm going to finish off by talking about one of the other aspects that we talk about in our research. So the idea of rotten apples. Obviously, whether we're talking about tax avoidance or bribery and corruption, sexual harassment, obviously we've had recently, as well as bullying and unethical leadership, we can all think of high-profile individuals from Harvey Weinstein to Bernie Madoff to Philip Green or whoever, who have been hauled over the coals for being particularly unethical. I think it's on the one hand, we need to recognise that it can be convenient for organisations or even regulators to say that ethical breaches are a problem of just a few rotten apples. It's not characteristic of the organisation as a whole, so it's enough for us to sort of sacrifice a few scapegoats. We don't need to make a larger cull. And please, we don't need any heavier regulation. That can be a typical response of organisations when there is an ethical crisis. On the other hand, we can't deny that individual factors do have an influence on how people behave. And so we've looked at this within the evidence base. So again, as Mel says, looking at the high quality scientific research in this area to see how two areas affect people's ethical and unethical decisions. Firstly, the less permanent aspects, so mood, essentially. And secondly, the more permanent aspects of personality, which are more stable, relatively permanent traits. So, mood, first of all. I have to come clean and say that there's actually a typo on the slide that I didn't notice earlier, so apologies for that. The first bullet should say, happy managers are more likely to agree to unethical requests, which is possibly counterintuitive, a bit surprising. It also says that fear and frustration are linked to unethical behaviour. What's going on with this? Why happiness? The root of the problem is not about whether you're in a positive mood or a negative mood. It's about how passive or active your mood is. So passive states, which include fear, frustration, and also happiness, can lead people to be more likely to engage in unethical behaviour. For example, because they want to sustain their current feelings of happiness, or they want to take the path of least resistance. So the kind of research that we're looking at here, an example is a study of 60-odd middle managers who responded to a range of different ethical scenarios in a lab-type environment. So first of all, their affective states were measured. That's to say, how they were feeling at the time was measured. Then they conducted these tests by responding to the scenarios. The researchers could gauge how willing they were to engage in unethical behaviour. The kinds of things that happened were that the participants were asked by a supervisor to backdate a shipping log in order to increase profits, stuff that they clearly knew was unethical, but they were being asked to do by their supervisor. And these are the kind of findings that it threw up, that negative and positive affective states can influence people's unethical behaviour. So one of the things to encourage here is for people to have to take responsibility for their actions, to feel responsible, to have what we call an internal locus of control, which means that you believe that that your actions make a difference, these things are more likely to lead to ethical behaviour. So what about the more permanent traits? When we think about personality, there's a number of red flags. We see, for example, competitiveness, how egocentric people are, how impulsive they are, whether they've got willpower or self-control, whether they have a kind of moral relativism, so they don't think that absolute morals really count for anything. In particular, what gets highlighted in the research is what's called the dark triad. So the dark triad is 3 sets of personality traits, which include Machiavellianism. So this is about disregarding morals, having just being willing to manipulate, deceive, lie, being less concerned with morals in the first place. It includes narcissism, so having high levels of pride, low levels of empathy, big ego, basically, feelings of grandiosity. And thirdly, psychopathy, so being impulsive, antisocial behavior, not feeling remorseful, feeling callous about your victims or other victims. Now, what we need to emphasize is that these traits are personality traits that can be measured. They don't make people guilty of unethical behavior. They make people more at risk of unethical behavior, especially when we're talking about situations that benefit them. So they can benefit from cheating, or, as I've seen in some of the comments, there are pressures from unreasonable targets, or a lack of resources, or working to time frames that are too high pressured. So these are some of the risk factors that, whether we like it or not, do exist. There is a question, though, of what do we do with this information? Would it, for example, be appropriate to use measures of personality to inform decisions in recruitment? We'd be interested in your views on this. So we've got a poll, which Stuart will manage, exactly that question. Would you test personality in recruitment to judge the risk of unethical behaviour? And to this, we've got a nice picture of Niccolo Machiavelli here to keep you interested.
Brilliant, thanks, Johnny. I've just opened up the poll. So there's 4 potential responses. Yes, for many roles. And then another yes response, but for a select few roles. No or don't know. So about half of you managed to hit your buttons. So it's just coming through now. It's a great question, Johnny, by the way. I'm looking forward to seeing A, the responses, and B, your response to the responses.
Yeah, I know. I'm interested to see them as well.
Okay, we've got about 70% through. I'll just give it another few seconds just to leave it open. And it does take a while then for it to collate in the background, and I'll publish it. I'm just closing it down now, so apologies if you're just hitting the button. Got another 10 seconds, Johnny, for it to show up on the screen. Yeah, we've had about 70% of people managed to get the votes through, so quite a high number of people therefore, so it should be a good reflection of responses. Okay.
Oh, a question coming through from someone saying, can tests be manipulated? I think they probably can. but there are pretty good tests out there.
Right. Responses are through, Johnny. Can you see them okay?
Okay, so do we have percentages on those? We got the numbers there.
Yeah.
So actually quite a mixed bag. A lot of people not committing. Fair enough. It's a tricky question. But more saying yes for a few select roles than anything else. And then either side of that, some saying yes for many roles and some saying no. I'd be interested in what people would see as the roles that would be appropriate for this. We don't have clear research on this particular area, but the kind of thing that I could imagine would be roles in which there is a strong moral leadership component to it. So most obviously, sort of spiritual leaders, for example. But I'd be very interested to know what other people's thoughts on it. Where we ended up on this is that the primary thing to do with these understandings of both mood and personality is to gauge the risk. Certainly don't prejudge people, but we want to be aware of these influences so that we can be aware of people's weak spots, the situations in which they'll be most susceptible to unethical behaviour. We need to understand the jobs that they're doing. What pressures do these jobs put people under? What can we do with this more practically is to do things like target reminders. So reminders to behave ethically can be a very effective way of increasing ethical behaviour. And also, you can know when the pressure points are, in what roles, and essentially when to keep an eye on people a bit more. The other thing that we would emphasise more practically is autonomy and voice. As I've said before, when people have a sense of agency, responsibility, they feel empowered, then they're more likely to behave ethically. So if we increase the level of autonomy that people have within their jobs, that's likely to help that, stop them feeling disempowered and likely to follow the path of least resistance and so on. Secondly, we can give people a voice, and I think this is important for two reasons. Firstly, it again encourages that responsibility, it encourages that active mindset. And secondly, it's a channel for raising concerns and, where needed, for whistleblowing. So that's all from me, and I think I will hand back to Stuart now. And if I can...
Brilliant, thanks, Johnny. Just before we do that, is there anything you not so much? I know there is one question. I think it's going to be relevant to your section because it came in about a minute ago. There's quite a bit of chat going from the poll, which is brilliant. The one question in there, because it's hard to spot with the stream of questions and observations, wouldn't this be tested in a one-to-one interview scenario based on the hiring manager's unconscious behaviour in regards to their views on unethical behaviour? There's a few comments either side of that as well, and if you've got a chance to see those, Johnny, now that you've taken your eyes off the slide, so to speak.
Yeah. So I don't think that's a sensible way to progress. If we are going to include aspects of personality in recruitment and selection, and I think we need to be really, really careful about that. As I said, it's not what we would recommend as the go-to solution. But if you want to make sure that you're using as robust tools to do that as possible. So I'd say, first of all, you need to identify, is it a job in which ethical risk is especially important? It's sort of critical beyond what it would normally be. Obviously, it's important that we're all ethical. And secondly, if you are going about it, if you are testing that, you don't want to do it in a face-to-face, unstructured interview. You want to do it through established psychometric tests.
Great, thanks, Johnny. There's one more. Well, there's two questions come in. Would you not firstly use psychometric testing and then you dive a bit deeper in the interview? So joining the two together, both the testing and the interview.
I probably would steer clear of the latter in terms of using a face-to-face semi-structured interview to try and gauge someone's ethical risk as an individual. I think if you get a very strong sense from those together that they may be highly narcissistic, for example. That may be that may make them less appropriate for a role in many ways. But if what you're trying to do is assess ethical risk, I would stick to those robust psychometric tests.
Great. Okay, there's another question coming, and let's rather than keep on with Johnny, let's let them off the hook and see if Mel and or Gwen want to take this one as well. It's a great question. It's a certain big question as well. So we're, because this will be recorded, but this is currently April 2020, which will mean a lot to people further down the line as we progress through lockdown. But do you think the current crisis situation, the economic situation, risk of job loss, etc., means that it's more likely for serious unethical behaviours? So what are your thoughts? Who wants to take that, either Gwen, Mel, or Johnny?
It's Mel here, Stuart. Shall I jump in and then Gwen?
Yeah, great. There's an addition there as well. Let me give you the addition. I'm reading them out just in case people can't see them. Yes, I only heard on the phone yesterday where employers were applying for furlough monies and not passing on to employees who are without pay. So there's an addition from a different participant there. So, and someone's already said that's fraud. So sorry, Mel, go on, pick it up. Great, thanks.
So I think that's a really interesting question. So as Stuart noted, obviously this is a really unique time, and we purposely not talked too much about COVID pandemic in this because this research wasn't done in that context, and also we want the recording of this webinar to be applicable in years to come. But it's certainly something that I was thinking about when I was walking out my slides. There's been a lot of discussion, hasn't there, about how people respond to the crisis, how business respond to this crisis. I think it's probably too early to say whether it'll cause more unethical behaviour. What I certainly think is there are some risk factors there. But I also think there's quite a lot of scrutiny at the moment for businesses. So there's a lot of calling out and coverage of unethical business practices. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that public scrutiny will perhaps pressurise businesses into doing the right thing.
Yeah,
so
thanks, Mel.
As someone just noted, there is some examples of poor behaviour already, but arguably some of those businesses didn't have ethical business practices before the pandemic, so it's perhaps unsurprising that they continue to do so now.
Yeah, that would be my reading of that, if I could just chip in there. So the example that I saw there was employers taking advantage of the furloughing monies to make a profit and not passing on to employees. That's, as someone says, just fraudulent. And if you're doing that, then presumably you'd be likely to behave that sort of way anyway. But I think that the question of are we likely to see more unethical behaviour now is probably yes. I think any kind of high pressure scenario raises the risk of unethical behaviour. This is one of the core sort of risk factors that we need to be aware of. People are trying to meet targets, make profit, and when it becomes more difficult, they may become more desperate.
Yeah, so if I can just add one thing to that, I definitely agree with what's been said so far, but in our research as well was done before the current crisis started. But going through the interviews, I happened to reread a conversation that I had with one senior ethics and compliance practitioner, because one of the questions that I asked to the interviewees was, what do you think will be the most challenging issues that you will have to face as an ethics practitioner going forward? And this one person said to me, I think it will be change, because we need to help our organizations to manage change in a way that is in accordance with the values that we have, with our ethics and ethical standards. So I think that reading that sentence in the present context, he was really right, because things are changing, and it might be that after this current crisis, some of the ways in which we used to work before, we have to change as well. And I think that probably this shift I was talking about from roles to values will be really, really important, because particularly in a situation where that isn't precedented, so we don't really know what to do very often. We can't say, oh, what did we do last time, because there was not a last time. So having these ethical standards and values that kind of guide us, and having a structure within the organization that can support all employees, but also probably leadership in the organization to avoid all these kind of types of behavior that were mentioned, but actually to guide the organization in a way that is in line with the values, I think will be very important.
Yeah, that's a great
great.
one to be
Sure.
space, isn't it, in these sort of situations when there's not a previous example of good practice, but there's certainly some ethical guidelines that we can stick to when we're making decisions.
Yeah, great. Thanks all. I've had one observation come through, and I'll share it privately so it's anonymous. This is why personality is so important. That those who do it will do it at any opportunity. Often it doesn't even have to do anything with pressure. So yeah, well said there. We've got one question coming through.
If I could pick up on that, I would say that's a little out of sync with the research findings that we come up against, which is that it's much more about risk factors. I don't think that you can identify someone's personality. You can identify someone's personality reasonably accurately, but that doesn't mean that they're always going to behave unethically. It's much more about their propensity to behave unethically. So I'd take that last comment with a pinch of salt, personally.
Right, thanks, Johnny. We've got 1 minute left. Let's just do a quick question, which will be relevant to what we've just been talking about, but more broadly, it's about communication. What are the effective ways of communicating the code, if there is one or one developed, to employees? So what's the best way to communicate our intentions?
I think there are many different ways, and probably one that I think is quite useful is to involve line managers, because encouraging line managers to communicate the code to employees, to have, for example, the ethics moments at the beginning of team meetings, for instance, of finding some time with their team to address an ethical dilemma, discuss it, and see where they can find guidance in the code. Would be a very, very useful way to also to make sure that line managers that are so important for the embedding business ethics in an organization are aligned with the core values of the organization as well, and then they are able to support their employees to do the right thing.
Great, thanks, Gwen. We're on time there, so is there anything else we need to get across, either from Gwen, who's just been speaking, Mel, or Johnny, before we wrap up?
I think one thing that I would want to highlight, in addition to what Gwen's just said, is that assuming that there are processes that for accountability within the organisation, one of the really practical actions that employers can take is to give moral reminders. So to think about at what points to give those reminders and communicate them effectively. So whether that's through online or through the forms that people use, however it is, to think about the most prescient points at which to give moral reminders, and then remind people of their duties at that point. That can have a big impact on ethical behaviour.
Great, thank you, and thanks all. And a nice passing comment there about storytelling should work as well, which I think is a good observation as much as a good question. Great, thank you everyone. A virtual round of applause for Gwen, Mel and Johnny, as well as for everybody on the session today. Really appreciate your time, energy and enthusiasm, as well as your comments towards the end. The questions going through have been really, really interesting to see that. I've also posted the recordings where they are on the website from sessions number 1 and 2. And the same link there that I posted will be where this session will be held. So if you want to go through it again, pick up on a particular section, slow it down a little bit, take a look at the slides, or even better, share it with colleagues as well, so they've got a wider application of what you've seen here, which is really, really important. So hopefully you can do that. I'll leave the session running. We'll close it all down in terms of muting and talking. If you want to scroll back through the chat, you can grab that last URL as well as the URLs you might see those posted throughout. So if there was something that caught your attention with a URL, you can click on that straight away and or sort of copy it, so you've got those references going forward. But thank you very much for those of you attending this session. I'm sure many of you have been on sessions 1 and 2 as well. So thanks very much all, and we'll wrap up the session there.